Narrative visual storytelling is one of the most interesting forms of media, especially in the commercial world. There's so many things to consider to get your vision across, as well as doing it in the short span of 30 to 60 seconds. In this video, we're going to be looking at a narrative commercial we shot, as well as go over how we planned, executed, and a full cinematography breakdown of this commercial project. Now, I'd like to start off saying that this commercial was funded by us fully, and this was a passion project that we brought to life with our own money. In this commercial, we explore the story of Yasuke, a Scarborough-raised rap artist that expresses himself through the use of Japanese lyrics in his music. The reason we made this commercial was to build our portfolio in terms of what we want people to hire us to create. Building your portfolio with spec work is the backbone of how we started this production company, and I strongly suggest you do the same in your work as well. For this project specifically, I was the director as well as the DP. As this was a project happening in the background of our regular work, it was shot in our downtime over the period of 4 months. Realistically, it was about 3 days of shooting. A big question you might have is, where did this idea come from? Now, I've worked with Yasuke over the many years shooting and directing his music videos. His story was very unique, and I wanted to showcase that in a 30 to 60 second spot. Now, I know Yasuke and his story personally, but I need to get that story in his own perspective. And to build that story, I had a simple interview with him over the phone, which I recorded so I could use for notes later. And this ended up being the backbone of the piece as well as a voiceover.
It's literally my journey, just start connecting dots and just like figuring out I could be someone outside of the box by being myself type thing.
From there, I just simply filled in the gaps with that recorded interview. I built the world we needed to create to tell his story, and this is seen through this deck here. We always like to build a creative deck, whether it's a project for us or a client. This just keeps us organized and keeps us in line in terms of what the vision of this piece is. The 5 main scenes of this commercial include driving around in his hometown, reflecting in his hometown, and this was 2 locations, so I considered this 2 scenes, recording at a studio, and expressing himself in his own mind. The main thing with Spec Project is utilizing what resources you have. All these locations were local parts of Scarborough where the artist is from. In addition, all those locations were free to use because of the artist's connections as well as our own network we have. For example, the recording studio scene was done when he was recording one of his upcoming songs. The apartment building scene is the building of a close friend of mine. And the hallway was built in my parents' driveway, which we have a full video if you're interested in seeing that. With a rough overview of the project out of the way, the next thing that we can look at is how we executed some of these scenes.
White girl make the journey real perilous. Apparently losing friends like I'm careless. 50 on the Jack, I'm Curtis.
The first scene that we're going to be looking at is this studio scene where the artist is recording. I wanted to start out with the why to show you the location that we're dealing with. We really lucked out with this location because it had a bunch of skylights in it, and where we were shooting, especially where the artist was performing, that the sun was blasting through that window. And when it comes to these locations, when you're dealing with natural light, it's all about timing. So we're shooting when the sun was about to start setting. So we're getting all this light blasting through this window as it was westerly facing. So in this case, there's a skylight here. Sorry, it's just a window. I'm going to refer to it as a skylight. And then there's another skylight actually above here. So this is really interesting because this is like a perfect 2-light setup, because we have our main key light here, which is on the right, and then our basically ambient, which gives us more levels to the room, which is on the top. There's actually another window behind us, and it's like over in this corner where the behind the camera is. And whenever you're dealing with these locations, it's always great to neg off behind the camera because this will give you that contrast that we're looking for. So there was a window that was behind here that we just basically wrapped a big negative fill behind. It was just a big black cloth, and that's the only really lighting setup we had to go into for this thing. We're going to be jumping into the tights as well as another scene in this location where we actually had to pop in some light. So this is the same exact setup. So we have that window here on the right that is acting as our main key light. So this is hitting our subject here, and this all has to deal with camera positioning as well as adding some negative fill. I know that we didn't have a lot of time as this was a live recording session in terms of setting up lights or anything like that. We had them on standby, but it was just one of those things of let's just shoot it how it is, and then also let's play with some negative fill. So again, we have that skylight in the top that is providing us our ambient as well as a nice hair light on our subject here. Right, so this is hitting his shoulder and also just adding that salt and pepper that we're looking for. And then our main key light is right here. That is giving us this harsh look. Whenever I have a harsh look, it's either outside or when I can have the window in frame or just give this preface that there is a window in a room. I don't necessarily like to have a harsh light and then you don't see where that light is coming from. And in this case, that light is coming from the window, and us, the viewer, can see that there's a window there and that is completely blown out, so we can see where the light is being motivated from. So, i.e., I can make this harsh. And you can even see that light more on his hand as well as here on his skin too. And as I said before, there's a window behind us, but we have that negged out as well as a lot of negative fill behind us. And you can see that actually in this wall here with a gradient going across this room. So it gives us more interest. If we didn't have that black curtain there, we'd get all light on this side of his body, as well as the room would be too lit. And there would be no contrast to look at here. We wouldn't really have an established shadow side. So whenever you're entering rooms like this, always establish your shadow side and do that by negative fill. The best thing I could say to bring on set is not necessarily lights. Always bring black material in terms of floppies, big black curtains, or any material that is black that can absorb that light. The next scene that we're going to be looking at is another scene in this studio, and this is the more interview. I wanted to make this more dynamic, as you can see that in the final piece, as he's saying that line as the camera is dollying out as well as tilting up. I just wanted to try something different in terms of being really intentional and not just do a random interview. So this is what we did here. And then to do this, I thought about doing it in the upstairs portion, but there was another studio downstairs that we kind of cleaned up and just put him here, and we thought it worked as well. As you can see at this point, the sun is already set, but this is our main motivating light from the window. It's not the same exact look that we were going for before, but we were just dealing with what we had to do. Now, if I didn't add any light to this image, he would be super dark, and this wouldn't be really appealing or anything in terms of establishing his shadow side or having Rembrandt lighting or anything like that. So at this point, we had to pop in a light. So I'm just going to draw this wall, which is on our right here, and then the ceiling. It's kind of an awkward shape. And then what I did is I bounced a Forza 500, and this was at a very low percent. I would say 5 to 10%. I don't exactly remember the value. And that was just simply shooting off the wall as well as the ceiling, and that would bounce right back into the front of his face. So as you can see here in this image, we have the window light actually giving us a nice like edge light here. And then to bring that light across his face a little bit more, we're actually using the Forza 500. And you could use any light for this technically, but that's just the light we had on standby. All right, we're getting nice Rembrandt lighting and nice wrap around his face. And to add the negative fill, you thought we would have to add a floppy or anything here, and we actually didn't. This studio just had a very dark nature to it, and us adding this light added ambient as well as the negative fill back to his face. Basically what I'm saying here, he was already dark, and we needed to add more contrast in terms of light parts of the image, and the way we did that was adding that light and bouncing it back. So this was just a very simple run and gun setup. We set this up in the span of maybe 5 minutes, and then we were practicing on the motions and not necessarily really worried about the lighting, because I knew a colorist could play with this a lot in post. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is this hallway scene. The way we did this is using Titan tubes, which is one of my favorite lighting fixtures. And then they are acting as practicals as well as our overhead fixtures too. So we have one tube here, then another tube here, as you can see. And then also, to actually give some light on his face, we have another set of tubes that are just above in front here. So that is our main key light, and this would be more of a hair light as well as to establish where this light is coming from. If we didn't have this light behind there, it would be very awkward in terms of like, why is this room blue? It'd still look cool, but it wouldn't necessarily basically tell the story that we're trying to do. This is very top lit, as you can see. His whole forehead as well as the high parts of his face is just highlighted, and the shadows part of his face is actually on the corners or the edges of his face, because if you look at the walls, they're all black, right? So that is establishing that we have the shadow sandwiching his face and not necessarily on a bias to one of the sides. And then if we just left this like this, we wouldn't have any of that light bouncing back up into his face and filling in those shadows. Because if we didn't do that, he would just have raccoon eyes and it would be so not really appealing. So what we actually have on the floor is some unbleached muslin, and that's bouncing all that light from our Titan tubes and those fluorescent fixtures back up into his face. So it's adding a bunch of detail back into the lower parts of his face, so it's not as super contrasty or harsh. So whenever you're doing top lighting strictly, I always recommend having a bounce under the subject's face. Not super close, but enough so it's not super dramatic or even scary like a horror movie. The last thing that I want to specifically talk about is this car scene, and we're going to be looking at multiple frames from this. If you're interested in how we got these car shots, I actually do another full breakdown in terms of how you mount this and get these shots, because these are really tricky shots to pull off with a small crew. So if you're interested in that video is linked up there. The main thing I want to talk about is backlighting and positioning your subject. So this is doing a lot of cheating and not necessarily hiding the direction we're shooting. In this case, the one thing that you have to remember, the direction that the car is traveling. Whenever you're shooting these scenes, you want to have whatever you're lighting your subject, in this case the sun, behind it, and that is backlighting as well, maybe considered a far side key in this case because we're shooting on the shadow side of our subject. So the car is traveling in this direction and then we're backlighting it, so this is giving us a nice highlights here and on the front of the car, everywhere basically. If you were looking at this image here, he's driving towards the sun, which in a logical point of view doesn't really make sense, but this is a commercial and no one is really ever going to catch it unless I just told you right there. So this was just finding the best way to light our subject and not necessarily think about continuity or anything like that. So again, our sun is on the right of our image and we're on the left, so this is like a far side key again, or backlighting our subject. This just gives us a nice shadow side as well, contrast to the face and just depth to the image in general. Because then if you look at, we're looking at basically a nice salt and pepper checkerboard. We have a light part here, and then we go to the shadows on his arm here, and then we go to a nice light part again on his hand, the steering wheel, and everywhere else. This isn't super contrasty, but this is one of my favorite shots from the actual piece as well, because there's just a lot going on in terms of composition and where the lighting is positioned. Right, so it's just very important that you try to keep your lighting consistent and not necessarily the driving direction in this case or where your talent is positioned. Unless it's super obvious, this is a nice cutaway, so we can get away with this, but in other scenes you might not get away with. So it's just something you have to consider when shooting these scenes. We just covered a lot of material in terms of cinematography, also creating one of these projects for yourself. But the question you might have is now, how do you go ahead in creating a project like this? Telling somebody's story in a short period of time can be tricky. But if you found this video useful in terms of executing this project, we have another one queued up here that you'll probably enjoy as well. If you have any suggestions for future videos in terms of breakdowns, let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.